Donald Trump authorized a military operation in a foreign country without congressional approval, an operation that resulted in civilian deaths, secured control over valuable oil resources, and was reportedly discussed with donors before it was ever presented to Congress. He later pardoned a man convicted of trafficking massive quantities of cocaine into the United States, all while publicly claiming to be fighting drug trafficking. And now his party is holding a congressional hearing to examine the legal justification for all of it, which creates a situation that feels a lot like setting a house on fire and then hosting a workshop on fire prevention. Into that hearing walked a sitting member of Congress who did something very different. She quoted Tupac. She brought up the Epstein files. And then she asked a question that cut straight through the entire premise of the hearing, why the rule of law seems to come with exceptions that only apply depending on who you are and who you are connected to. On March 18, 2026, the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Oversight convened a hearing titled, "With Remarkable Confidence, the Legal Basis for Action Against Venezuelan Drug Traffickers." A title that immediately raises a more uncomfortable question: what happens when the legal argument behind it does not hold up? Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas, a former criminal defense attorney trained at the University of Houston, was given time as the ranking member. And she used that time to do something that shifted the entire room. She asked direct, structured questions that expose just how fragile that legal argument becomes the moment you apply it consistently. What you are about to watch is not just a political exchange. It is a step-by-step breakdown of how a legal justification unravels under its own logic. Here's what happened.
I'm going to start with Tupac. We're going to start with the fact that Tupac famously said, for those of you that didn't necessarily listen to rap, that we've got money for war, but we can't feed the poor. And the reason that I bring this up is for two reasons. Number one, in order to get Maduro, the estimated cost is $3 billion. I can guarantee you that a lot of Americans would say, yes, there's a valid warrant and things like that, but for the cost of $3 billion, let's put our money somewhere else. Number one. Number two, Professor, you talked about the fact that if there wasn't the loss of life as it relates to our service members, or if this was just kind of quick boots on the ground for a second, then it wasn't war. So just answer this question for me. Would you consider what is taking place currently in the Middle East a war because we continue to have our sons and daughters returned in caskets to the United States? That's a yes or no?
No, the analysis for Iran is different.
Oh, okay. Okay, so you agree with me then? Yes?
I didn't say that.
Oh, okay, it's different analysis. So I'm just going to go with you agree with me because this is clearly a war and it's unconstitutional. That is the bottom line. And frankly, as it relates to Venezuela, I think that we still will have some time to determine exactly how bad it is. Because imagine for 2 seconds that you had fishermen and sailors that were coming from the United States, and Venezuela all of a sudden started bombing our people, saying, oh, no, you're bringing guns. Because let me be clear, America does their fair share of nonsense in other countries. We tend to supply everybody with the guns. We flood this world with guns everywhere, right? So let's say they said, you know what, we don't want all those guns going to the gangsters in our communities. So we're just going to start blowing people up. And frankly, legally, that may work for them. You know why? We have a constitution, and not everybody does. And so it is offensive to sit here and engage in this conversation as someone who practiced criminal law. And my God, everyone that I had, no matter what they were accused of, even if they were accused of capital murder, they were given an opportunity to actually show up in court and face their accusations, not be killed. So the justification, I don't understand why we are trying to make it partisan. It should not be partisan to just go and blow up these boats. Are you saying, Professor, that you believe that blowing up these boats because somebody believes, you know what, let me do it this way. Let's say they are drug traffickers. Do you believe that it is constitutional for the United States to blow up people that are accused of being drug traffickers?
So it's not going to be a yes or no question. If I could take
okay, then I'm gonna stop you there because I only got so much time. And Professor, I was really loving on you because you came from South Texas, which is down in Houston, not too far from the University of Houston, where I got my law degree. But it is very clear that it's unconstitutional for us in the United States. Let me give y'all another issue that I don't understand if y'all see it the way that I do. There's this little thing called the Epstein files. There's a lot of people that have been found liable, charged, all kinds of stuff, from Prince Andrew and Peter Mandelson, from Norwegian officials, the former prime minister, and the former ambassador, all these different people, right? Some would argue, especially since there was international trafficking that was taking place, some would argue that our president, whose name is found over and over and over and over in these files, may have engaged in, say, child trafficking, sex trafficking. They may come to that conclusion. Now, with that being the understanding, if there are other countries that believe, because they believe in actually holding people accountable, okay? So they say, you know what, there were some girls from England or wherever, because there were people from different countries, and they say, you know what, we gonna just come and we're gonna drop in on America. We're going to bomb America. We're going to kill civilians in America because, you know what? We have a warrant for his arrest. Whether it's for the child sex trafficking in the Epstein files because America doesn't want to do their job, or whether we're talking about violating international law, whether we're talking about going and just randomly killing people. I can tell you that every single one of you that is sticking up for him right now would be screaming from the rooftops. The analysis has to be the same. I am so offended that I am still paying my daggone student loans for law school, and it seems like none of it matters nowadays, because seemingly what we do is we twist the law to justify. The analysis is the same. If you would be outraged if they came and bombed our country to go after him, to arrest him, if you're listening, that I don't know if people are doing this. But if they decided to do that because of the Epstein files or because of violating international law, you all would be against it. So we should be against it right now. Thank you, all you.
If it felt like you just watched someone bring actual constitutional law into a room that was running on talking points, that is because you did. And that reaction you are having right now, that sense of frustration, that feeling of how is no one stopping, this is not misplaced. It is the correct response to a contradiction being exposed in real time. And the reason it feels that way is because once you move past the rhetoric and look at the actual evidence, the justification presented in that hearing does not just weaken, it completely falls apart. So let's walk through the receipts. Start with the core claim used to justify the operation in Venezuela. The administration argued that this was about drug trafficking, specifically fentanyl. The claim was that Venezuela, under Maduro, was contributing to the fentanyl crisis in the United States in a way that required immediate military action. That is the foundation. That is the argument. There is just one problem. It is not supported by the government's own data. The DEA's National Drug Threat Assessment. Again, this is not an outside source. This is produced by the same government, making the claim has never stood Venezuela as a source country or a transit country for fentanyl. Not once. Not in any edition. The State Department's March 2025 drug trafficking report, written together with the DEA, states clearly that Mexico was the most significant source of illicit fentanyl and fentanyl analogs affecting the United States in 2024. Venezuela is not mentioned anywhere in that document as a fentanyl source. And when you move beyond fentanyl and look at cocaine, the numbers do not change in a way that helps the argument. According to the DEA's most recent cocaine report, more than 84% of the cocaine consumed in the United States originates from Colombia and enters through Mexico. Again, Venezuela is not identified as a primary pathway, and drug policy experts who spoke publicly after the January 3rd operation were not ambiguous about this. The director for drug policy at the Washington office on Latin America stated directly that the fentanyl crisis has zero connection to South America or the Caribbean. Zero. That is not a small discrepancy. That is a complete disconnect between justification and reality. So now the question becomes unavoidable. If this was not about drugs, then what was it about? And here is where it stops being speculation, because the answer was given openly. At a Mar-a-Lago press conference just hours after the operation, it was stated that the United States would run the country temporarily, that American oil companies would enter and begin generating profit, and that the United States would extract a significant amount of wealth from the ground. The Secretary of Energy followed that by stating that the United States would control Venezuelan oil sales indefinitely. And then comes the detail that should reset the entire way you are looking at this. The administration confirmed that it had spoken with major oil companies before and after the operation. Oil executives were briefed 10 days before the land strikes. Congress was not informed. Now pause there, because that detail matters more than anything said in that hearing. Private industry was notified before elected representatives. That is not a communication failure. That is a hierarchy of priorities. And when Congress attempted to respond, when 5 Senate Republicans joined Democrats to pass a War Powers Resolution, a law specifically designed to limit the president's ability to initiate military action without approval, the response was not compliance. It was dismissal. The law was called unconstitutional, the senators were called stupid, and the War Powers Act, a law created in 1973 to prevent exactly this scenario, was treated as optional. Constitutional law professor Kermit Roosevelt explained it in plain terms. The framers of the Constitution did not intend to give a single individual the authority to take the United States into war. That power was intentionally divided. And yet what you are seeing here is an attempt to consolidate it under a different label. Not war, not invasion, enforcement, operation. Something that sounds administrative but carries the same consequences. And then there is the timeline that makes the contradiction impossible to ignore. In December of 2025, 1 month before launching a military operation justified by drug trafficking, the president pardoned Juan Orlando Hernandez, the former president of Honduras. This is not an allegation. This is a conviction. He was found guilty in a United States federal court of helping traffic more than 400 tons of cocaine into the United States over nearly 2 decades. He was sentenced to 45 years after a full jury trial, with legal representation, evidence presented, and due process fully observed. The sentencing judge described him as a two-faced politician who paved a cocaine superhighway into the United States. And yet he was pardoned. Now compare that to the justification used in Venezuela. Individuals accused of drug trafficking were targeted with military force. No trial, no court, no defense. And to put the scale into context, the State Department's own estimates suggest that roughly 200 to 250 metric tons of cocaine transit through Venezuela each year. Hernandez was convicted of facilitating more than 400 tons over 18 years. One was tried and pardoned. The other was targeted without trial. The receipts are not just contradictory, they are separated by a single month on the calendar. And this is exactly where Crockett's Epstein argument becomes devastating. Because what she did was take that same logic and apply it in reverse. The Epstein files, released in January 2026, contain repeated references, with one name appearing more than 1,000 times. Flight logs show at least 8 trips on Epstein's private jet between 1993 and 1996, directly contradicting previous public statements denying that travel. Independent reporting has indicated that the Department of Justice withheld dozens of pages of Epstein-related documents, including interview notes from an accuser, despite legal requirements to release them. Now her point was not to prove guilt. That is not what she was doing. Her point was to test the standard. If allegations, documents, and perceived evidence are enough to justify military action abroad, then that same standard can be claimed by other countries. They could say, "We have a warrant. We have accusations. We are acting." And every single person in that room knows exactly what their reaction would be. They would reject it immediately, which means the standard being used is not universal. It is conditional. And once a legal standard becomes conditional, it stops being law. It becomes leverage. Now step back and look at what this means beyond this single hearing. Operation Southern Spear, the name given to the extended military deployment in Venezuela, has involved up to 15,000 troops and has already cost more than $600 million. There have been statements suggesting that United States taxpayers may be reimbursed through oil revenue generated by companies benefiting from the operation. which, translated into plain language, means public funds were used to secure private economic access, with the expectation that the return would justify the cost. According to testimony referenced by Representative Crockett, the first sale of Venezuelan oil following the operation was completed by January 20th and was valued at $300 million. That sale reportedly involved a company whose owner had donated $6 million to the campaign. That claim is still pending independent verification, but it has not been denied. And regardless of that specific detail, the broader fact remains unchanged. The president stated directly that access to oil was a central motivation for the operation. So now the math becomes clear. Hundreds of millions in public spending, dozens of lives lost, military force deployed, and the stated justification fentanyl is contradicted by the government's own data. The actual benefit oil access was announced openly. And this is where the second layer comes in, the part that goes beyond what was said in that room. Because what is being tested here is not just policy, it is the redefinition of legal categories. If you can frame military action as law enforcement, if you can redefine a strike as an arrest, then you bypass the entire constitutional structure designed to regulate war powers. No declaration required. No congressional approval required. No oversight required. Just a claim of authority and the execution of force. Legal experts have warned about this explicitly. Georgetown law professor Steve Vladek stated that this approach subverts the constitutional order by allowing offensive military operations under the pretext of executing an arrest warrant. The New York City Bar Association described the operation as a violation of the United Nations Charter. The Brennan Center called it flatly unconstitutional. And 5 Republican senators agreed strongly enough to break with their party and support a war powers resolution. And yet, none of that changed the outcome. The operation continues, the oil flows, the troops remain. The legal justification presented in that hearing failed to produce agreement among experts because there is no coherent legal basis to defend. The Epstein files remain partially withheld despite statutory requirements. And the same executive authority that pardoned a convicted trafficker is being used to justify military action against accused traffickers. This is not about Venezuela. It is not even really about drugs. This is about whether there are any enforceable limits left on what a president can order the military to do, whether constitutional constraints still function as constraints, or whether they can be reinterpreted as optional guidelines depending on the objective. Because once that line is crossed, it does not reset. It becomes precedent. And precedent does not need to be argued again, it only needs to be cited. Jasmine Crockett did not bring Tupac into that hearing for effect. She used it to frame a basic truth. Resources are being allocated, legal standards are being bent, and the justification for it does not survive scrutiny. The same logic used to justify force abroad would be rejected instantly if applied at home. The people defending it understand that. They are relying on the assumption that most people will not follow the argument far enough to see where it leads. But once you do follow it, once you apply it consistently, there is only one conclusion left. This was never about drugs, and it was never about law. It was about power, and whether anyone is still willing to enforce its limits. And this is where we need to step back and look at the full picture, not as a political moment, but as a structural one. Because what you just saw is not an isolated contradiction. It is a pattern where legal justification is shaped after the action, where evidence is selectively emphasized, and where consistency is treated as optional rather than essential. And once that becomes normalized, the question is no longer whether a specific operation was justified. The question becomes whether the framework used to justify it can be applied again and against whom. Because the real danger here is not just what was done, it is what has now been made possible. When military force can be reframed as enforcement, when accusations can replace due process, and when oversight can be dismissed as inconvenience, you are no longer operating within a system of law. You are operating within a system of discretion. And discretion, by definition, does not require consistency. It only requires authority. That is why Crockett's argument matters more than it may have sounded in the moment. She was not just challenging a policy, she was testing a principle. And the response, or more accurately, the lack of one, tells you everything you need to know. Because if a standard cannot survive being applied equally, then it was never a standard to begin with. This is how legal erosion happens. Not all at once, not in a single decision, but through a series of justifications that are accepted in isolation until the exception quietly becomes the rule. And by the time people recognize it, the framework that was supposed to prevent it has already been redefined. So the takeaway here is not just about Venezuela or Epstein or even this administration. It is about whether the rules that govern power are still being enforced or whether they are being rewritten in real time. Because once the boundaries of power become flexible, they rarely move back. They only expand. If this video helped you see that more clearly, then it did its job. And if you value this kind of forensic breakdown where we don't just show you what happened, but walk you through what it actually means, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for more. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.